Hi, everybody. This is Barb Cardell. I'm PWN-USA's training director. My pronouns are they, them, their. And I want to welcome everybody to the PWN Harm Reduction Principles and Practices webinar. We are very appreciative that you are here today as we do some deep learning about harm reduction and partner with the Harm Reduction Action Coalition. And we have Tanagra, Melgarejo, and Natalia Gibbs, who are going to be our subject matter experts today and are going to share some really deep learning, deep opportunities to think about harm reduction and how it impacts both the work that PWN does, as well as how we move through our social justice spaces. So with that, again, I want to welcome everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Tanagra, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Barb, and thank you, Tiomi, for supporting us and for allowing us to have this space today. I'm really excited. If you allow me to gush for a second, I have been a fan of the work that you all do for a long, long time. And when initially folks from PWN reached out to us to see if we could collaborate, I screamed a little bit inside of my head from joy. I am so excited to have the opportunity. I'm humbled to have this space today, and I'm really excited that we're going to get to do some learning together. I want to allow my colleague and collaborator and sister in arms, Natalia Gibbs, to introduce herself as well. She will be supporting me with this, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Thank you for that, Tanagra. My name again is Natalia. I use they or she pronouns. And yeah, I'm the LGBTQ and harm reduction coordinator at the Harm Reduction Coalition, and I've been there for almost 6 months now. So I'm really excited to be part of this with you.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, can I move the slides through or how does it work?
I can go ahead and, whoops, look at that.
That's okay.
Totally remove everything. Yeah. Nope, I can go ahead and I can give you remote control access.
Okay.
Right there. And
oh, there we go. Let me see it. Can I try it? Oh,
yeah.
Let me see if I can move it. Move the slides. I'm trying to. Oh, no.
Usually there's an arrow at the lower left-hand corner.
Lower left-hand corner. Left. Let me see. Let me see it here. You see more. Okay. Oh, I can't see it. I don't know why. I think it's
all the way a little bit over, a little bit more left there. Yeah, there's arrows, and that's how you move it. Yep, exactly.
Okay. Video shut it here. No.
Oh, are you ready to start the video?
I'm ready to. Yes, if we can.
There you go.
Yeah, I don't know if I moved that or. Oh, is it me? Yeah. Okay, so thank you. Sorry about that, people. I am not very technological minded, but I promise you that I'll make this work. It's always a struggle. So I am part of the Harm Reduction Coalition. I'm sure many of you know who we are. We're based out of Oakland and also New York City. I am based out of Oakland today, and Natalia is across the coasts in New York as well. And we have been around for 25 years. We were founded by people who use drugs, for people that use drugs. And the idea behind the Harm Reduction Coalition was to really acknowledge the fact that folks that use drugs were being left out of conversations around the impact of HIV and AIDS in people's lives, particularly around the early 90s. And so folks that were activists that were involved in the movement got together and founded the Harm Reduction Coalition. And from then we have grown to be a national organization. And these are some of the areas that we work in. I am part of the trainings and technical assistance component of HRC. Natalia as well. We're doing a lot of work together to support folks that are interested in expanding or implementing harm reduction or learning more about harm reduction. We also work around overdose prevention and are really committed to transforming policies that are harmful to people to create policies that are holistic and centered and grounded in people's well-being and really uplifting people's human rights. and their right to live free and safe in this world. And we have a national conference that it's happening, hopefully will happen. We're really excited that it's going to be in Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from. If you detect an accent, that's why. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. And so I was so thrilled when I found out that the conference would be happening there and that it will be hopefully happening in October. But given what is happening with the world at this point, it's all uncertain. So we're crossing our fingers. And I invite you to visit our webpage where you will find an area that has resources and publications that we have compiled over the years. And please feel free to download any materials that you see there that you think are useful to you, to share them with your community members, with your friends, with people that you think would benefit from them. We encourage folks to take them and use them as they see fit. And if there's something there that you see but you can't access, don't hesitate to reach out to either Natalia or to me. And if we have access to it, we'll make sure you get it. And if we don't know how to get it, we'll find the person who does and we'll get it to you so you can have them. And so now I am going to see if this works. I'm going to play this video for folks. Cross our fingers and our toes that this will work. Think of me. Let's see if Zoom lets us. Oh.
All right. So Tanagra, I'm going to go ahead and take control of the screen back over because I do have.
Okay.
Space of time with such a short statement, I felt that it applied to my whole life.
The North Star statement is that the Harm Reduction Coalition creates spaces for dialogue and action that help heal the harms of racialized drug policies.
I heard the North Star statement. I felt incredibly seen.
Un documento que habla directamente acerca del impacto del racismo.
North Star statement acknowledges the fact that the U.S. government made policies and laws to police and harm people of color.
The drug policies in America are deeply racist.
He's deeply racist. And so we need to be able to accept that and understand that and not be scared of that.
The North Star statement recognizes that the war on people who use drugs is an intersectional issue.
The statement recognizes the need for action and it recognizes the need for healing.
I think it's really important to say it and to commit to it out loud.
I got really lucky because I have an immense amount of privilege and I have a lot of options and a lot of choices that didn't get taken away from me regardless of my drug use because of that privilege.
The North Star statement means to me is about giving back to the community.
In line with meeting people where they're at, but not leaving them there, that means that we need to focus our energies on meeting those communities that have been marginalized, left aside, silenced.
Bringing people together and having a dialogue.
Not to only have dialogue, but the Harm Reduction Coalition to be one of the agencies to actually address the systemic issues that create the marginalizations and discriminations within our safe community.
The North Star statement is a commitment to change.
This may be hard for some of us to hear, but the harm reduction movement is not immune to institutional racism, no matter how allied we believe that we are.
The North Star statement is a promise on Harm Reduction Coalition's behalf
to undo these policies that grew out of a totally socially unjust racist background.
To keep a focus on how people of color are most impacted by the war on drugs so that we can maintain that at the forefront of all the work that we do.
We're not just fighting to advance harm reduction interventions. We're fighting to address the root causes that lead people to be vulnerable to drug-related harms.
The North Star statement means to me that I work in an organization that has the commitment to address racism head on.
It may also involve conflict, but we shouldn't shy away from that conflict. Without conflict, we can't grow.
The North Star statement is a way forward. It's hope. It's being acknowledged by the people that I work with and alongside in a way that I feel like I haven't ever been in any other movement. So I guess it means everything.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. And now that we are finished, we can share the link so folks can view it and have access to it. And I see that some folks recognize some faces from the Harm Reduction Coalition. I saw some folks that recognize Daniel and Emma as well, who are in our New York office. I wonder if we could maybe I can move to the next slide. Thank you. And so the North Star statement we put out the North Star statement 3 years ago, a little bit longer than 3 years ago, when Monique Tula became our executive director. And it reads, the Harm Reduction Coalition creates spaces for dialogue and action that help heal the harms of racialized drug policies. For us, the North Star statement is broader and more profound than a mission and a vision. It's our moral commitment. It's what leads us and guides our work. And in the midst of the conversation around the opioid crisis, we have forgotten that the people of color have been incredibly impacted and harmed by the war on drugs for many decades before. And that as the public narrative changed around a kinder and gentler approach to navigating substance use, because folks who were being impacted or perceived to be impacted were mostly white, that we were forgetting the fact that people of color have been bearing the brunt of these harms, and that we cannot ignore that the war on drugs harms everybody, that it's a harmful war regardless of race, and that impacts more profoundly women, female identified folks, etc. So if we felt it was important for us to bring that to the forefront of our work, and also for us to do some internal work. To be really honest with you, we've been trying to do this work and it has not been easy. We have tried to acknowledge and recognize how white supremacy culture impacts our work and how our organization is framed within that, and also the impact of other intersections of people's identities. And so we're continuing and committed to doing this work. And acknowledging that we need to sit in a space of openness, kindness, and braveness, if that's a word, that brave space to really lovingly challenge ourselves individually and each other as an organization as we continue to move forward. Because we can't ask the community to do this work if we're not willing to do it ourselves and go through it and learn from it. So I don't know if Natalia, if you want to add anything, but it's been a beautiful, intense, and very messy experience. But harm reduction tends to be messy, so that's okay too.
No, I think you covered it really well. So I will, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Okay, and I think we should move to the next slide. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand it off to Natalia, who's going to lead us through this section.
Yeah, so just to go through really, not quickly, but our group agreements kind of to set the stage for this space. If you have any questions about any of them or anything I say, or want to add anything that you feel like would make this a good space, please feel free to put that in the chat box. But our first one is make space, take space. We do have a couple of kind of group activities, so we really want to encourage people to use the chat box. I think we'll have opportunities for folks to come off mute and share their experiences or wisdom. And also our next, which leads me into our next one, which is use I statements. So we always want to speak from our own experiences. And so using I statements helps with that. Waste, which stands for why am I still talking, is kind of one of our ways to kind of reel things back in when we go off into tangents, which are sometimes helpful and important, but just to make sure that we're always thinking about what something that we're saying is adding to the conversation. Say It Ugly is one that we use, where this is a learning space. And so, you know, sometimes we're working through how to say things and how to express our opinions. So we encourage people to say it ugly, and then we can work through and find a meaningful way together. Our next one is Find the Root. So just remembering that tension is a secondary emotion. So when things feel tense, or you kind of sense something in yourself, to take a moment so that we can explore that together and understand what the root of that is. We also want to remind people that this is an equal opportunity to learn space. So we don't want anybody in this webinar to feel responsible for educating the room or holding and carrying an entire group's experience. So we just want to leave that for you guys. If it doesn't apply, let it fly is just another one. Obviously, some of this information will be useful, some of it won't be. Some of it will feel applicable and some of it won't. So if it doesn't apply, just let it fly. And our last one, as Tanagra briefly mentioned, that we want to encourage a brave space or a safer space. We know that no space can be 100% entirely safe. So we don't really, you know, have control of everything and anything. So just to encourage people to step into this space, share what feels comfortable to share, and know that we'll try to hold each other with loving kindness. And I think we can go into our next one. So some more context as we get into this. We believe that if a person identifies as a woman, that they are a woman, and we don't question that. We also acknowledge that women with trans experiences live in an increasingly penalized, are increasingly criminalized in ways that, and are exposed to other harms that cisgender women are not. We also believe that we must listen to and center all women's experiences when we're approaching our work. And we know that in order to minimize potential harms, that we must work from an intersectional framework. Next slide.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to jump in here and ask folks if you feel comfortable using your chat box and chatting to us why you think people use drugs. Why do we use drugs? I see that, the cope stressors, pain management. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I see, okay. Oh, enjoy them depression. I see, thank you. Yeah, I thank you folks for sharing some of your thoughts around why we use drugs, right? And I see stay awake, I see enjoyment, fun for some of us is to navigate depression, to navigate physical pain, emotional pain. Sometimes it's related to navigating trauma as well, to maintain energy. It is a way for us to fill a void. It is a way for us to survive. I think for me, substance use, PTSD, I see that as well, anxiety, stress, and depression, they feel good. It's also something that can give us a sense of structure and security in the way that we arrange our lives around substance use can give it meaning as well. I see increasing social connection. That's a really good point, as well as comfort. For some folks, this is the way that we relate to our community, to people that we love, that we care about. For some of us, the folks that we use drugs with are the people that have cared for us and held us and protected us, right? And so there's many different reasons why folks use drugs. And thank you folks for sharing with us why we use drugs. Now I want us to go to the next slide and I want to ask you another question. And I love that folks are engaging with the chat box. This is really fun. And I want to ask us, why is it that we just don't stop using drugs? Do folks have some thoughts and ideas around that? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So for some folks, we don't stop using drugs. I love this. We don't stop using drugs because we have a physical dependence. And if we stop or quit, then we don't have access to the means that we need to help us navigate and manage. That could be physical, emotional, or mental health pain around that, and situations that are attached to that. Some of us don't stop because they feel good, because we don't need to stop their use in order to function. And Natalia is going to lead us in a little while through a continuum of substance use, and it's going to help us see that drug use in this society has been framed in a dichotomy or in opposites and binaries, and that it ignores that there's a whole spectrum or a continuum through which people can move in relationship to their substance use. I think we don't stop using drugs because that would mean losing our community, losing our supports. It is a choice that as an autonomous human being, I love that, as an autonomous person, we're making, and that it's also something that helps fulfill a need for safety, a need for energy, a need for community, a need for a space of control over who we are as people, right? So if you notice a pattern or a thread, is that the same reasons why we use drugs are the same reasons why we don't stop using drugs, right? They're all connected, they're all intertwined. And harm reduction is a tool that allows us to begin to unpack these reasons, to look at the ways in which people use drugs and the reasons behind that, and to try to understand if those reasons are not reasons that we share in terms of experience, right? To really begin to, from a brave space, to look at the people that we're surrounded with, the people that we love, the people that are friends that may not share our experience, and try to understand, you know, what's driving that experience and what they need from us in terms of support, if that makes sense. Next slide, please.
And before we go to the next slide, we
Yes.
actually have someone who raised their hand and wanted to make a comment.
Okay, awesome. Yes.
Juanetta, you are, if you take yourself off of mute, you're able to go ahead and ask your question or make your comment. And Juanetta, I think you are off of mute. All right, looks like that is not going to be our friend today. So if we can get Antoinetta, yes, looks like you're off mute now. Antoinetta, did you have a comment or a question?
No, I already made the comment. I already wrote in. It was answered. Thank you.
Got it. All right, thank you. So just to let everybody know, because we know that it's been a long day, and if you're not able or willing to type into the chat box a question, if you raise your hand in the attendee mode, we can go ahead and take you off of mute and you can go ahead and ask it, because I know that some people have some physical barriers to typing in questions or are just on their phone, and so we'll go ahead and make this as interactive as possible. So just raise your hand and we'll take you off mute. So thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, everyone. And so harm reduction is a spectrum of strategies, and that spectrum of strategies includes safer techniques for substance use, managed engagement, and abstinence. So when we think of harm reduction, a lot of the times one of the things that I hear from folks is that abstinence is not part of harm reduction. For us, abstinence is a huge part of harm reduction. As long as the people who are interested in abstinence are able to choose that for themselves, that is not imposed. Like with anything else, I don't know for you all, but for me, whenever things have been imposed on me, I have acquiesced. Is that the right way of saying it? I had agreed to those terms and conditions until the moment that I figured I got what I wanted, and then I went back to the same behavior that I was practicing before because I had not made that choice for myself. So with any of these things, whether safer techniques, which means having access to supplies, having access to an naloxone to avoid overdose, having access to condoms or to lube or to any of those safer techniques that are included in harm reduction, it's the same thing. Like you have to choose them as you have to choose managed engagement or abstinence. Choose them from your own terms as well so that it works. It is also the part that it's, I think the one that I'm most attached and connect to in terms of harm reduction, to me, is a framework that helps us understand structural inequalities. And it really allows us to look at the way that people's identities intersect in this society and within this capitalist, hetero-colonialist, patriarchal, capitalist, trans and homophobic world that we live in. And how is it that we can and need to understand these intersections to be able to understand the harms that impact people, and that is going to look different based on that person's identity. And finally, for me, another important piece is that harm reduction asks us to meet people where they're at, but not leave them there. And as I was trained as a social worker, and one of the things that I realized in my training was that I didn't understand this properly. That I was meeting people where they're at only because I was dragging them to me, meaning bringing them over. That I really truly wasn't meeting people where they were at because that made me uncomfortable, because I didn't understand or because I didn't agree. And it was not until I realized that this is not about me, about what I agree or not agree upon, but this is about the other person and really supporting that person's desire to move through the world in a different way or to stay where they're at and to be safe, that then I would truly be meeting them where they're at. And so this is not necessarily only like in the physical term, but also in the I think in more of the philosophical term too, of meeting people where they're at. And sometimes that means that we need to ask questions through caring curiosity to understand and support someone if that person's experience is not ours. I don't know if people have thoughts or ideas, but we can take some questions if people have them. If not, we can move to the next slide. So harm reduction is necessary, and I think you all probably agree with this and know, because we need to respond to disproportionate rates of people are dying and people are getting sick because people are not getting access to the healthcare that they need because of stigma and shame, because of racism, because of capitalism, because of misogyny and trans and homophobia, right? And so harm reduction is a way to allow us to reach folks that are in vulnerable spaces, and to connect with them in a way that centers them and that sees them as human beings. And it allows us to keep engaged with folks, whether or not they choose to engage in our services, whether or not they choose to go and look for treatment, whether they have gone back to their behaviors, such as relapse, or whether or not they're abstinent from drugs and sex. It's a way of engaging with people and keeping connected to them, because we're making space where they're safe. And I think that's the piece for me that is really powerful about harm reduction and why we need it, because sometimes we keep pushing people out because they're not complying or doing the things that are expected of them. Next slide, please. And so harm reduction gives us the opportunity to challenge stigma, to really push back on stigma, to create a space where we can center the voices of people that are traditionally unseen, where people are human, when people are heard, when people can sit in their power, and we can support them in making the change that they need. It increases trust with our participants, and it can foster, as I was saying, that engagement where people have ownership over their processes and their lives. And it helps us improve not only public health, but I think society in general, the conditions in our society, because if we're challenging oppression and if we're trying to create systems that are challenging oppression and that really are centering people's human rights, then I think we're improving not only public health, but just the well-being of humanity in general. And I think that's a piece of harm reduction that is really important as well. Next slide, please. And so some of the things that harm reduction is not. Harm reduction does not mean anything goes. Harm reduction allows us to have conversations that are challenging sometimes and difficult sometimes, but important to have around behaviors that are risky and that can be dangerous. And the important thing is that we are able to have those conversations because we're having them from a place of respect and because we're centering people's dignity when we're having those conversations and people's autonomy and well-being. And so harm reduction understands that drug use, and not only drug use, but all the systems that are interconnected, you know, the systems that punish drug use, like the prison industrial complex, the criminal and justice systems, all those systems that intersect, and there's other systems that are adjacent as well, right? That those systems also are there and that they create harm, right? And harm reduction, as I was saying, the other piece that is really important about this is like we look at risk, but we look at risk in a way that is more complex and more nuanced, as well as it doesn't dismiss or exclude treatment or abstinence as a viable option. And many folks actually thrive and are really healthy and successful in their sobriety. And they found that sobriety through harm reduction programs. And I think that that's a piece for us that it's also that this a good reminder. A lot of folks that go into treatment actually are able to go into treatment and are successful because they were connected to those treatments through harm reduction programs. Next slide, please. And now I am going to hand it off to Natalia.
Yeah, and I saw a little thing in the chat box about turning on the video, so I can do that. So the risks that I know Tanagra was talking a little bit about the importance of using, I mean, we talked about an intersectional framework, but also in thinking about some of the socio-cultural factors that influence kind of drug use and whatever risky behavior. So this is a model that was created by a psychologist, I believe, in the 70s. And he was white and was looking at the people around him that he knew that were using drugs. But, oh, can you go back? Thanks. So he was looking around him at the people in his life that were using drugs, but their lives were relatively unaffected by their substance use, but looking at kind of the comparative media portrayal of usually Black and brown people using drugs at that time and the incarceration that was happening and all of these negative consequences for people who were using the same exact substances. So he developed this drug set setting model, which we've kind of expanded out to risk set setting, which talks a little bit about how some of the risk, and when we're thinking about risk, we have to think a little bit more broadly than just what the behavior or the drug itself is. So it kind of breaks down into a couple of components. There's the risk, so the behavior itself and what is inherent to that. So thinking about specifically drug use or specifically sex work, like some of the things to consider would be, you know, there are different risks from using meth versus using heroin, and that there are certain risks that are inherent to each of those drugs that have strictly only to do with the drug itself. Then there's the set, which is the mindset that brings somebody to a situation. So that includes your moods, your thoughts, your expectations. So kind of this idea that maybe somebody can you know, come home after work and have a glass of wine and use that to unwind and kind of settle down, but then maybe go out on a different day with friends and have a glass of wine, and that feels like more of something that's going to get them up and ready to party and engage with their friends. And so it's not like anything around what the substance in that situation has changed, but somebody's mindset, being tired after work versus being out with friends, has kind of changed the experience and also changed some of the risk that might be involved. And the setting is also thinking about some of the physical and social and environmental things about where a person is, because those can really contribute to the risk of a situation. So if we're thinking of somebody who is homeless and maybe, let's say, using in the bathroom of a McDonald's with somebody banging on the door for them to get out, the risks that they might be thinking about or navigating in that situation will be entirely different from somebody who's housed and has a safe place to use. So when we're thinking about risk and we're trying to help people and support people through navigating a situation and making choices that feel good for them, we want them to understand that risk is a little bit more encompassing than just the specific behavior itself. So this is a helpful model to kind of give us a more comprehensive view on that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And so this is our lovely spectrum that Tanagra mentioned. I think that it's really, really important to kind of break away from that binary of thinking. And sometimes even spectrums don't even do the whole picture justice. I feel like this seems like it's kind of like a stepwise thing, but it's important to understand that people can be anywhere on the spectrum at any time, and that they can jump from place to place at any time. So usually when we think about substance use and we see it in the media or we see it anywhere, we kind of get this image that really speaks to kind of one end of the spectrum, which is this chaotic or persistent use where things are falling apart and everything is a disaster. But drug use is really more nuanced than that. There are people at all stages on the spectrum. So there are people who are not using at all, people who only use in experimental or situational places. It has to be the right configuration of people or places. There are people who only use socially with friends, people who kind of use regularly, every so often, every couple of days, whatever feels good. There are people who have ritual binges where maybe once a year during this specific time, they'll engage in substance use. There's people who use daily, but don't find that to be chaotic or persistent or disrupting anything else that they want to do, but it is part of their daily habits. And I think what's important to remember about this is that, again, it's not a stepwise. It's not like you have to go from experimental to social to regular use, but that people can hop around and people can be at multiple places on this continuum at the same time. Maybe somebody has found that for them, alcohol is not something that they can engage in, so they're not using any alcohol. But maybe, you know, once a year they go out with their friends and take a trip and use meth for a weekend. And that is kind of their ritual, and that's something that they can maintain and they feel really comfortable with. So it's not only that you can be anywhere on the spectrum and jump from anywhere to anywhere, but you can also be in multiple spots on the spectrum because people use multiple substances. So it's important to kind of think about this and help people find which is the right place for them. You can go to the next one too. So these are the 6 principles of harm reduction that really help us, give us that framework to understand and to meet people where they're at. So the first one is health and dignity. And this is this idea of autonomy that I saw in the chat box earlier, that everybody deserves health and wellness for whatever that looks like for them, and also the dignity to choose and be offered all of the resources they need to achieve that. The next one is participant-centered services, which is this idea that all of these services and all of the ways that we support our participants have to be centered around them. They should be making decisions and setting goals and deciding what and how these things look for them, and that their goals and ideas and thoughts are always being centered in the moment. Participant involvement kind of extends from that, and this is this idea of kind of by us, for us. And it's pretty much that if you want to make things participant centered, and if you want to make programs that really serve the community, that participants have to be involved. They have to be contributing input. We always acknowledge that people are kind of like the masters of themselves. They know themselves the best. And so if they're not being consulted in a meaningful way, then how can programs really serve them? Participant autonomy is, again, going back to health and dignity, that people have the space to non-judgmentally and non-coercively make decisions that feel right for them. The sociocultural factor element is kind of going back into this idea that people are gauging risks based on their settings and their environment. And so if we're not cognizant of that, we can't really be providing non-judgmental care. If we're not kind of aware of, let's say, this idea that a cisgendered woman and a trans woman are having completely different experiences and interactions with society, with the criminal and justice system, with all of these institutions, then we can't properly serve them. And again, the last one is pragmatism and realism, which is this idea that we have to be realistic. We have to acknowledge that there are risks. Some of these risks are serious. We don't want to be hiding information or not sharing parts of information. We really want to be realistic about this is what can happen and this is what can't, so that people can make informed decisions about what they want to do in their lives. So I see there's, let me see, there are a couple of so the use of drugs have a different effect on every individual separately. Could we assume that its effect could also be basis of experience of trauma? I think that's 100% correct. I think that's when we're thinking about sociocultural factors and we're thinking about participant-centered services, being trauma-informed is a really huge part of that. Because if you're not thinking, like, again, going back to the example that I use, that let's say a cisgendered woman and a transgender woman are having completely different experiences interacting with law enforcement. And that will play back into trauma, because there's a lot of trauma in the media. There's a lot of trauma that people share with each other. And so if we're not acknowledging that part of those things that we need to be aware of is trauma from institutions, trauma from society, trauma that's intergenerational, then we can't really be providing, health and dignity and care that's realistic. I don't know if you have anything to add, Tanagra.
Thank you, Natalia. I agree. I think that you said it beautifully, and thank you so much for doing so.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions about some of these principles? Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide. Oh.
Sorry, everyone. This is why we get a little bit of a heads up that Zoom has been really glitchy today. I think a number of people have been using it to connect with their communities, and so
yes,
capacity is definitely a little pared down. So while I am getting our slides back up, Tanagra, do you mind talking a little bit about the connection? You and I were chatting about the connection to the Denver principles.
Yeah, so the
something about us, right? Yeah.
They're very similar, and I think that they're similar because they came about at the same time. As I was mentioning, the part of the history of harm reduction movement is that it started in the 1990s, and it was adopted and taught and created by people that use drugs for people by and for people that use drugs in the midst of the HIV/AIDS crisis in this country, and the fact that people were dying and people that use drugs were being left out. And so they came up with this principles, the first initial harm reduction working group, which, if you give me a minute, maybe I'll look up the names of those folks and I can share them before we finish with you all. The initial harm reduction working group that started here in Oakland, California. And we still have some of Joyce Rivera is one of them. She's in New York. There's some folks that are, Imani, yes. Imani was part of the initial harm reduction working group, and I am going to look at the names and I'm going to share them with you all. And they came up with these principles, and they are the basis for our work. And they're very similar to the Denver principles, because they center people's autonomy. They center the fact that people that have these experiences are the ones that should be driving the process, and that they're the experts, and that they should be the ones that are leading our movements. So yes, I love the fact that there's these beautiful historical connections that are happening.
Great, thank you. And thank you for talking about that. We should have our slides up so that you can see them again, and we're good to move forward if you're ready.
Yeah, so some of the kind of like really traditional, or maybe not traditional, things that we think of as what does harm reduction look like in practice. We think of syringe access, and not just syringes, but all of the materials people need to use drugs safely in the way that they want. Being able to dispose of syringes, being able to use all drugs safely, so not just drugs that are kind of in the media a lot, which right now I feel like is opioids, but just remembering that people use all kinds of drugs in all kinds of ways, and they need to be able to do that safely. And naloxone is a huge kind of harm reduction service, and it's I'm sure that most people are aware, but in case you aren't, it's a medication that can be used to reverse an overdose from an opioid, which is super important, especially in these times as people are kind of acknowledging more and more the overdose crisis that is happening, and really wanting to take steps to protect people we care about in our communities. Medication assisted treatment, so for people who are looking to change the way that they use drugs, for certain drugs there are medications that you can use to help with that. Supervised consumption sites are another really big one that a lot of people, including the Harm Reduction Coalition, are doing a lot of work to make possible, since we don't have them here in the United States, but a safe place for people to use the drugs that they use, which is a huge factor in thinking about risk. It's the entire setting portion of that model. Having drop-in centers where people can go and access resources that they need, like showers or just a place to sit and not be bothered. Housing first, which is a super important model, and understanding that so many of the risks and so many of the hardships that people face would be much alleviated if they had housing before anything, and that it's really hard to navigate any other situation when you don't have housing. Being able to access pharmacies that are compassionate and that are also, accessible in all kinds of ways, like geographically, cost-wise, whether they're compassionate, whether they have the medications you need when you need them. And also a huge part is referrals. So acknowledging that we can't do all of the things in-house sometimes, and so being able to provide people with good referrals is super important. Next slide. Oh, and there is a question. So safe house, are the safe houses in so that is kind of like an influx situation, in that they were trying to open a safe consumption site in Philly, but then they had some fight with legislation and then eventually got that overturned in their favor, but are now having a lot of community pushback, and so they haven't opened anything in Philly yet. They have a space and they're technically legally allowed to do it, but they haven't, but it's a little bit more complex of a situation. Okay, and then I will pass it off to you, Tanagra.
Thank you, Natalia. I just want to make sure. So when we think of harm reduction, for us, it's a holistic approach that allows us to support people and create spaces for people to be healthy, and also to help us understand, for those of us that work as providers, that we're gatekeepers, and that, you know, if we're gatekeepers, we also hold institutional power to allow people access to resources, and that we have to be really mindful of that power. I always say I have power that I want to use for good, and also I want to have my colleagues, you know, if I am doing things that are harmful to people, whether it's I'm aware of it or not aware of it, like I want my colleagues around me to be able to give that information to me and call me in and say, hey, you know, you have to be mindful of this, because sometimes we're not aware of how our own prejudices and our own relationship to stigma can interact or interfere in our relationship with participants. But what we want is to create spaces that are convenient and accessible, that are positive, spaces that are honest, that are centered in the people that we're working with, centering their experiences, their autonomy, where we are provided with evidence-based practices, where we are not creating spaces of biases, but on the other hand, that we're creating spaces that are open to understanding the diverse needs that our folks have, their diverse experiences, and also to center their power and to allow them to inhabit that power. So when we're thinking of harm reduction, I think of all of these things as, like, I would like for all of us that are engaging any kind of service and any kind of structure or system to be able to be centered and grounded in that, and to include our voices as well when we're thinking of building programs as well. Next slide, please. And so I want to I'll open up this for a moment of conversation, and folks, if folks feel comfortable using the chat box, as well as if folks, I don't know if we have the possibility of maybe having folks raise their hand using the tool here in Zoom. But if you have thoughts and idea around how the stigma looks, how does it look or feel like, I would love to hear from folks. What are your thoughts on that? I'm going to try to keep my chat box open.
Yes. Thank you, Tanagra. And if people would like to raise your hand, I can go ahead and take you off of mute so that you can go ahead and share thoughts with us, or you can just go ahead and put it in the chat box, whichever feels more comfortable for you.
Wow, that's really powerful. Thank you. Having like foot on your neck, or somebody having something over you, that it's such a visual, right, of what exactly how stigma can feel like to have one up on the next one. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we have Angela who would like to go ahead and share something. Angela, you go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to. And looks like you're unmuted, so you can go ahead and talk if you're ready. Yeah. Angela, one more time if you want to try and ask your question or make your comment. You're unmuted, but it might be that just your phone is blocked. So one more try. All right. So looks like we've got a lot of good answers in the chat box. So
yes,
sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It looks like they said that there's something wrong with their computer.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. And I really appreciate everybody that shared in the chat box. When I think of stigma, it's exactly that. Stigma looks like pain. It looks like harm. It looks like invisibilizing people. It looks like pushing people aside or away. It looks like oppressing people. And it feels like that too. It feels like we are, those of us that have experienced stigma, that there's this label that is attached to us, right? and for whatever reason, that label that is attached to us, it's also tied to our worth as a human being. And stigma denies people the experience of feeling worthy and feeling seen. It dehumanizes people. Thank you for that. And so it doesn't feel good. Stigma doesn't feel good, and it's not a good experience to go through. And it's hard sometimes because it's that feeling of shame and silence that is, I think, really pernicious, and not feeling safe to share when this is happening to us, as well as experiencing this as an aggression, as violence, that because it's not tangible necessarily. I always think that stigma is not a thing that you grab, right? Stigma is an experience, and it can be then, because we live in a society that is very oppressive and hierarchical. If you don't hold, societal power, then it can be denied. I feel a stigma, it's really easy to gaslight people when you're experiencing stigma, because people tell you, oh, you're making it up. That's not really what happened, right? And I see hopelessness and isolation lead to that experience of gaslighting as well. So stigma is really harmful. It's one of the contributing factors, if not, as I think you all said, it's one of the main contributing factors of harm for people that are engaging in behaviors that society has deemed problematic, right? Because we're not looking at the whole human being, we're looking at their behavior, and the person becomes their behavior, and that's the problem. Thank you, everyone, for sharing that. We're gonna move to the next slide, please. And so I want to share with you, I am I'm a visual learner. I was talking the other day to, I think it was to Natalia, and I was explaining to them that I'm a visual learner, and I want to share with you this tool, and hopefully it will be useful to you too. But when I first saw it, I really appreciated it because it allowed me to grasp onto this concept that I know I had experienced, and to be able to explain it to other folks in a way that I could hope they could understand it as well. So when I think of stigma, stigma starts with ideas, right? And I think folks mentioned that in the chat box. Stereotypes that we hear, see, that are perpetuated, that are normalized by people in society. So we think people who use drugs are incapable, people who use drugs are fragile, people with experiences around substance use are dangerous and cannot recover. So we start thinking about people in a certain way. We have those ideas, and then those ideas become stereotypes because we start applying them as a blanket to everybody who fits that particular experience, right? And so from ideas, then we move, I think we move here to the heart, right? If you can see me. And then we start believing things about people. So we're thinking them, and then we're feeling them in our hearts. We think that people that use drugs are scary. We think that people with mental health conditions are shameful. We think that people with physical conditions are less than, and they are people that use drugs, that they can't make decisions, that they're not trustworthy, that they are liars, that they're not good parents, right? So we start thinking about those ideas, then believing them, and then they become prejudices, right? Then those things are things that we feel in our heart and in our gut. And then they lead us to behave towards people in a certain way. Those prejudices and ideas then start moving us into actions, right? They're going to permeate those actions. They're going to inform those actions. And those actions can happen in several realms. And here we're focusing on the social realm and the structural realm. So we start then doing things to prevent people from living next to us. Or we start thinking, oh, I don't want that treatment center in my community, or I don't want to work next to someone who uses drugs, or I want their kids to play with my kids. And then in terms of structural discrimination, we see that we don't hire people with lived experience, present or past, or lived expertise. We don't support people in recovery. We don't think whether or not our health insurance covers someone's medication-assisted treatment, right? And that's something that happened real life for the Harm Reduction Coalition. I'll give you an example. We did not realize that our health insurance did not cover access to medication-assisted treatment for our staff until we were changing insurance companies. And our colleagues who were needed access to medication, to that medication, had to pay for it out of pocket for years. Because they didn't feel that they could raise that to someone in the organization, right? So this also was because, you know, we experienced internalized stigma, and we experienced stigma from other systems out there, the healthcare system particularly. And so it was a moment for us to sit in humility and to acknowledge that, you know, we were harming the people that we care about, were also people that work with us, right? And how to shift that and change that so that people could have their needs met. So stigma from an idea to a belief to our actions, right? And actions are the things that we see because, and those are the last consequences of stigma, right? I hope that this is useful to you all, and I encourage you, if you think it's useful, to take it and use it and share with other folks as well. And then if there are no thoughts or questions, we can move to the next slide, which tells us stigma is the belief, right? And discrimination is what we see. Thank you. Next slide. And stigma is internalized, right? And these are some of the ways that we have heard and seen and experienced stigma being internalized, and we just want to share some. And I'm sure if folks have others, I encourage you to chat them in the chat box or use the tool to let us know if you want to share with them verbally. People judge me because I am someone who engages in sex work. There are no friendly healthcare services where I live. This is something that I heard very frequently from participants that I worked with, and also for my own self. Healthcare workers don't trust me, as if I just want to use drugs, or I just want drugs from them. This is something that it's really pernicious and dangerous. I've had friends that had gone to the hospital to seek care because they're in pain, and they've been denied pain medication because they have a history of substance use and they think that they're drug seeking. In fact, I had one participant that I worked with who was a survivor of a hit and run accident in Puerto Rico that had to go to the hospital because her leg was broken in 3 places from that hit and run accident. And she thankfully was alive, but she was in a lot of pain. And she called me crying from the emergency room because she had been waiting for more than 24 hours for a doctor to give her pain medication because they thought that she was there drug seeking. And I'm like, so she made it up. She made up this accident. She broke her leg in 3 places so that she could get pain medication, right? And to me, that is just an example of the degree of dehumanization that people that I love and care about experience, and the damage that it causes, and the pain, the unnecessary pain that it causes people, right? So that's just one example of that. I get arrested for drug use instead of helping me find ways to cope or other ways to access the systems so that I can get the support that I need. Sometimes I don't have a place to live, right? And without access to equipment that is new and clean, I have to share. And then there's, you know, stigma around sharing as well, because there's this idea that if I share my equipment with other folks, I don't care about my health or their health. And people that use drugs are very much concerned about their well-being as well as their community's well-being also. I see a question. I see all these things happening in the chat box, but one of the things I wonder, yeah, there's a question around mental health, right? And how does it impact our mental health? And I wonder if folks have thoughts around that. Natalia, if you have thoughts around that, or other folks, I'm happy to hear them. I definitely have some thoughts around that particular question myself. Thank you for raising it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like there's a huge effect. I think, I mean, Tanagra, you just did a really good job of talking about internalized stigma and how that can affect your mental health, especially if you aren't feeling like you're capable of doing many things, or like you have the ability to access good care or non-judgmental resources. That's definitely going to affect your mental health. It's definitely going to, both in a practical way, like maybe you won't seek care for any mental health issues, but also maybe contributing to them.
Yeah, and I think for me, one of the things that it led was to feeling not worthy, to feeling that I didn't deserve to be healthy, to be well, to ask. and seek support and help. And that leads you then to that spiral of isolation and silence and shame that I think folks were talking about. And that really then impacted my mental health, because I felt really isolated, really alone, really ashamed. That drives you to engaging in behaviors that we mentioned earlier when we started this conversation, that are coping mechanisms that are healthy because they're the ones that we have, but not necessarily the healthiest. And so, and because they also exposed me to other areas of harm and danger. And so it's that spiral, right? That it's really intense and dangerous. I think there's a question between what is the difference between stigma and prejudice, right? And I think prejudice is one piece of stigma. It's like one of the conditions that we need to fulfill to have stigma. It's crucial in the existence of stigma, but stigma is the whole experience, right? Is the thinking, is the idea, is the feeling, and is the action, right? It's all of those things together. So prejudice is one piece of the experience of stigma. I hope that makes that, it's clarifying that.
And I think something that I might add to that is like prejudice can be kind of sometimes an individual experience, and that somebody can be prejudiced in a moment and maybe use stigma as a tool of that. But I feel like stigma also has this really larger institutional context that sometimes we don't always get a chance to think about or have acknowledged that is real. And that it's not just that, you know, somebody could have a negative thought or do something discriminating or prejudice against somebody who uses drugs, but then there's this entire society that is saying things and making media and talking about people who use drugs in a specific way. And so I feel like stigma sometimes also comes with that very much institutionalized and part of society aspect that prejudice sometimes can be maybe smaller scale.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalia. I think it's okay if we move to the next slide. Thank you. I love this. And so we have a stigma can take different shapes and forms. And I think through your comments and through the conversation that we had just a couple of seconds ago, that we started getting into some of these, right? So there's stigma from individuals. And this is something that we've seen also in communities that experience oppression. You know, like I've seen it, for example, an example of this is I used to work at a drop-in center in Holyoke, Massachusetts. For those of you that are familiar with that part of the world, I lived there for many years, and that's where I came to harm reduction. And at the drop-in center, a lot of the times we would hear folks, it was a drop-in center for community members and for people that use drugs. And so we had everybody come in, and a lot of the times we'd hear folks that use heroin say really disparaging things about folks that use crack. And we would hear folks that use crack say really hurtful things to people that their drug of choice, or they had a problematic relationship with alcohol, right? And we would hear then folks say really harmful things or hurtful things to folks who were part of the diaspora, right? So we had folks that had been born and raised in Puerto Rico and had recently moved to Holyoke, and folks that had been born and raised in Holyoke, right? So Puerto Ricans from the island saying things that were harmful to folks that had been born and raised in Holyoke out of a sense of superiority, right? Stigmatizing things, that you're not Puerto Rican enough, you don't speak Spanish well, right? All these things. And that stigma from individuals comes from what Natalia was saying, from a society and a system that it's invested in having us hate each other because it's easier for them to control us then, right? So there's the stigma from individuals, and then there's institutional stigma, right? And I gave you the example of the hospital as one of my friend and my, that had her leg broken into places and had gone there to get medication for the pain, and was told that she couldn't get it because you know, she was drug seeking because she had a history of substance use. And I think I've seen this happen when I've had, I've gone into spaces where friends of mine, and somehow my friends are getting followed, but I'm not getting followed. Because I look a particular way or a certain way that makes people feel more comfortable with me than the people that I'm with, right? And so that's also institutional stigma, having folks have that experience of being treated differently because of how they're perceived in different settings, whether it's healthcare, housing, reproductive health services, the court system, any of those systems that we interface with. And then there's internalized stigma. And this is the stuff that we say to ourselves, right? This is the stuff that I was telling you, like I was sharing, like I felt, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm going to use a swear word. I'm shit. I'm a bad person. I'm a bad parent. I don't deserve to be treated with kindness. I am horrible. All those things that narrative, right? That starts in our head, but doesn't start there really. It starts outside. It starts in those structures and how those structures are forcing us to see ourselves, right? And really takes away the ability for us to be kind and compassionate and to really look at ourselves in the way that, to look at ourselves in the way that centers us as human beings, right? It's like that mirror is clouded and we can't see because there is all, the steam when you're taking a shower and the steam is there and all of a sudden the steam starts going away, you can see yourself really, right? So that self-stigma is that steam. You're there, but you can see yourself. And then stigma through association, which is sometimes, we have experiences where we have friends or loved ones who engage in behaviors that society doesn't sanction or doesn't agree with, or stigmatized behaviors, right? And then because we're connected to folks, then we're also experiencing that stigma, right? I had a colleague who was from a really small town in Puerto Rico. And whenever her whole family had struggled with substance use and they had been incarcerated, and whenever she went back to the town, the first thing she heard people say, oh, here's the daughter of so-and-so, the ones that are always in trouble, right? And this has been going on for years because, she was stigmatized through her connection, through her family, right? So these are some of the ways that stigma shows, the ways that it can take shape in society. I don't know if you have questions, but if not, I can pass it on to Natalia, who's going to lead us through the next.
So some other key elements of stigma, that are really important in terms of, we can talk about stigma and what it is, but how does that play out in our lives? So one of the big parts is blame and moral judgment. So kind of the whole idea of the drug war was based on this idea that people who use drugs were somehow, it was their fault, that this was some type of moral failing, that people who didn't use drugs were somehow superior in whatever way, shape, or form. And that was a tool that they used to perpetuate that stigma. The other part of that is criminalizing, is that, if beyond having this blame and moral judgment, we criminalize people, we isolate them, we put them in jail, we put them away, we exclude them from society, and we make it almost impossible for them to ever come back, which is what criminalization does. And so it puts this fear and this element of, well, the way we think about jail and criminalization is that, well, that's for bad people, and that's where bad people are. And so the only logical thought for somebody who doesn't really have any framework would just be, oh, well, if this person is in jail for doing this thing, then it must be a bad thing and they must be a bad person. And so it really makes it hard. And there's a lot of other things that go along with criminalization, like making it harder to find housing, making it harder to find jobs. And so that kind of thing sets up the stigma to have really long lasting effects for people and for kind of the generations that come after, either through like stigma by association or kind of setting people further back so they can't really get ahead. It pathologizes and patronizes people. So this idea that we're sitting and having this conversation that people who use drugs need to have autonomy means that people have been patronized to this point and pathologized that there's this idea that they don't have autonomy or shouldn't have autonomy, or that autonomy was taken away in the first place, which is a huge part of stigma. And then fear and isolation, which kind of comes away from all of this, is that now that all of these things are kind of in play, it becomes scary to talk about substance use or talk about using drugs because you are afraid of all of those possible things that might happen to you. You don't want to be criminalized. You don't want to be pushed away from your family and your friends and your job and your housing and all of these things that are now at risk if you are open or talking about substance use in a way that goes against some of this. So those are some big elements of stigma and how it works. And we can go to the next slide. So the big kind of main functions of stigma is this idea that it keeps people out. So it creates differences between people. It keeps people away. So it puts this idea of danger and that people need to be kept away, and that it's for the rest of everybody else's safety, that there's something at risk. And it also keeps people down, so it discriminates. So not only are you separated and kept out of society, which is important for us to live and thrive, but you're kept down, and it's made hard for you to ever kind of come back from that. Next slide. So a big part of stigma is language. Language makes it so hard for people to kind of see past, because if you've heard this term or you associate with this term, you know, all of these things have connotations. And so sometimes we don't think about it just because how it's been like interlaid in music and media, but it's really important. So words like junkies and dope fiends, crackheads, crack babies, that was a big thing in the 80s. And then later it came out that there was no actual syndrome or any type of repercussion for people who use crack during their pregnancies. So that was a huge place that stigma really impacted a large generation of people and the generation that came after them. Drug addicts, drug abusers, drug users. So now there's a big push to move towards people first language. So things that you'll hear us use or see in these presentations are things like people who use drugs, people who inject drugs, people who live with HIV. And those are really important because they center people first, and remind us that these are people we're talking about. And another one that's really common is kind of this idea of clean and dirty. We have clean and dirty needles, we have clean and dirty drug screens, we have clean and dirty people. And this idea that something that is dirty is inherently wrong or not good, when it really is just a needle that's been used or not used, or a test that shows something positive or negative. So it's really important to separate that language, and also to take some time sometimes to unpack it and see where it's coming from. Next slide. I will pass it back to Tanagra, I believe. Talk a little bit about autonomy.
Thank you, Natalia. And so we are now going to dive into what we think are the intersections between the harm reduction framework and bodily autonomy, which is a framework that I borrowed from you all when I do this work. So I want to put it out there that I've used your materials, and I am so grateful that you all came up with this in a way that makes sense to us, that really reflects, you know, I think that there's such an intersection between that framework that you all created and the idea of like the framework of harm reduction. So I'm just grateful that I am able to find a way to connect these two. Next slide, please. And I think we need to click it once more. Yes. So when we're thinking of harm reduction in our daily lives, and we're thinking about bodily autonomy, is thinking about how these two things intersect and how we see it for ourselves, and also when we're engaging with other people. Sometimes I think about, you know, what I would do for myself, it's good for me. And that doesn't mean that I have to impose it on someone else, right? What works for me, but not necessarily it's going to work for someone else. And sometimes I'm mindful of sharing my experiences, because then it can set up this idea that somehow the way to go is the way that I want, instead of allowing people the space and the opportunity to try things out for themselves and to have the space to be autonomous in that sense. I think there's a couple other things in that slide as well. I'm not sure. It also requires, when I'm thinking of harm reduction and applying it and thinking about bodily autonomy, it requires me to listen openly. And this is hard. I think this is hard because sometimes we're so wired not to listen, but to react. I don't know if there's a way of saying that in English. I'm trying to think of the concept in Spanish, right? But you were already prepared with your response, right? And for me to listen openly means I'm sitting here, I'm holding space for you, I'm holding space for me, I'm in tune with my emotions and in tune of what I'm feeling in the moment, and I'm trying to work from a space of not having judgment, but sometimes we do, so I don't want my judgment to interfere. I want to push that out of the way because I know that if I let that come up, then I'm going to stigmatize other people's experiences. And for me, you know, the other piece is the piece of being humble. And I think that this is also challenging, particularly because we work from systems that have set us up to think that we're the proficient. I'm going to need help with this pronunciation of this word in English, professionalization. Is that the right word? Of folks, instead of like taking people's experiences and acknowledging people's expertise as what should center them. And so sometimes, you know, we center or give privilege to professionalism or that experience of being professionalized in a field versus the person's experienced as life experience, right? And to understand and ask questions, right? When we're hearing certain scenarios that are known to us, when we feel that it might be awkward. Like I remember working with someone once and they came up to me and said to me, someone that I worked with who was pregnant and who was involved in a situation, and they said to me they were pregnant, and I asked them, I said, so tell me more, how do you feel about it? And they were like, well, I don't know how I feel about it. Thank you for asking me how I feel about it, because everybody that I keep telling this tells me like, congratulations, you must be so happy. And then I feel really shitty saying, I don't really feel happy. I don't know how I feel about it, right? And so it's really trying to create that space where if it's not familiar to us, where it's something that is unknown to us, where it's not our own experience, to sit back and ask questions with what Emma Roberts, who you saw in the video, our colleague Emma asked, is caring curiosity, right? It's asking questions from a place of love and kindness and trying to understand, and for us to do our own learning, right? As we ask those questions. And understanding also sometimes that these conversations can be really awkward because we're talking about stuff that it's uncomfortable for people sometimes. And because of stigma, even makes it more awkward, right? Because it's shame that is involved as well. And because there's all these layers of silence and of fear. So it's really thinking about, you know, sitting in a place of humility and really holding space for people. Next slide, please. And so I want to ask folks, what do you think? What do you think prevents women from experiencing bodily autonomy within organizational settings when they're navigating substance use experience, past or present? What do you think about, you know, having bodily autonomy in an organization for women who use drugs? Like, what would that look like? And in what ways do you think the principles of harm reduction and the framework of bodily autonomy intersect? So I would love to give a second for folks to look at these. And if you have thoughts or responses to any of those, please feel free to share them. I think it's vital to have space for people who show up for the work, absolutely. Going to try to also. Absolutely, I agree that it's having space, it's really trusting and listening to people's experiences and centering people's experiences as the most important piece, right? In this work, and trusting people, right? Minimizing pain. Receiving services is often tied to restricting choice, right? Exactly. As well. The systems are set up to not give people choice, but to tell people what to do. It's imposing things on people. So sometimes those of us that want to work differently are working against systems that are forcing us, are set up to do things in one way, which is to harm folks. Absolutely. patriarchy. I know. I always say we need to burn the systems down. I want to burn them all down. I want to burn the patriarchy down. I want to burn the capitalism down.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Listening to folks, really listening to people. Yeah, sometimes I have to say thank you for some of us have shared on the chat box. I see that like our organizations are not exempt from this because sadly we inhabit and live within systems and we're part of those systems, right? And we are built to resemble sometimes those same structures that are oppressive to people. And I think it's also thinking about how is that we can start as an institution and the institutional level to shift and change some of those structures to create more freedom for people and to really transform people's experiences, right?
I think that's
Yeah,
a huge thing, because I feel like a lot of times people think that, you know, having these conversations, even though they're super important, that, you know, when we say deconstruct, like, that is active work. And so if you know, we can know about it, but if we're still not doing the active work to deconstruct it, then it's still going to be there.
Absolutely. And I think it's hard work and it's really tiring work and it's emotional labor that goes into a lot of this deconstructing. And it can feel really lonesome, right? Because we are forced to be siloed also. So I think part of the beauty of the work that Positive Women's Network does is that you have chapters all over the country where you're bringing this beautiful wave of strength, this tsunami of power, of women power, to really challenge and push and change. And I think what you're doing is a model, you know, in terms of thinking about shifting and transforming conditions for people, like a model that other movements can learn from, particularly the harm reduction movement. So I'm grateful for the work that you do because it's giving us a template that we could potentially take and use to shift the conditions for the folks that we work with and we care about, and for ourselves too, right? Thinking about the ways in which we can also, sometimes we're bystanders, and when it's okay for us to intervene when we're seeing something happening, right, that is harming other people as well. And I think we could move to the next slide. I would also say that you all can come back to those questions and continue to have conversations around them. And now I want to share in a scenario. And Natalia and I were talking that I was telling Natalia that this scenario is the composition of 3 different situations that happened to me and other people when I was back in Puerto Rico, right? So it's in a scenario we tried to adjust it to some of the realities of your organization, but it really comes from the experiences of other folks that were involved in this, well, years ago, in 3 different settings, right? So I want to know if it sounds familiar, because I think that like this is an experience that it can be fairly universal to those of us that are doing this work, particularly because we're so siloed. And I didn't learn about harm reduction until I was in the harm reduction movement. And when I left harm reduction and I started working in the intimate partner violence movement, we were not talking about harm reduction there. And yet a lot of the work that I was doing, or most of my work, was grounded in these principles, right? Because once you adopt them and you sort of like, if you drink the Kool-Aid, I want to say if you drink the coffee, because right now I would love a coffee, but once you drink that coffee, you know, it permeates your cells, right? It's like you start embodying it. And so I realized, you know, that folks in the intimate partner violence field were not aware of what harm reduction was. And I realized how important this conversation was, because, you know, we could lessen so many of the harms if we were able to practice from that framework, right? So I want to share the scenario. So we're gonna give folks a chance to look at the scenario, and then we have some questions for folks around the scenario. So we can come back to the questions once we have the scenario. And I wonder, Natalia, would you mind reading it, since you have a lovely voice?
Thank you. So Tanya is a member of your organization that is traveling as a part of a group attending a summit in another state. Both Tanya and Darcy she is assigned to room with Darcy. Both Tanya and Darcy are acquaintances and have been in shared space together, but don't know each other very well. During the first night, Darcy stays out until 3 a.m. and when she shows up in the room that she is sharing with Tanya, it is clear that Darcy is intoxicated. She is making noise, trampling over stuff, and all of the ruckus wakes Tanya up, who is annoyed but does not say anything to Darcy. Tanya decides to silently observe Darcy during the day, and it appears that Darcy continues to be intoxicated, and this is triggering for Tanya, who in the past struggled with alcohol and substance use. She has been in recovery for 10 years and is not happy that her sobriety is being put at risk by Darcy and the organization's leaders. The drop that overflowed the cup was when Tanya walked in on Darcy while she was locked in the bathroom, drinking and using drugs. Or so Tanya thinks. An angry and scared Tanya started screaming at Darcy, and from there things escalated quickly. Hotel security got involved, and when organizational leadership found out about the situation, both members had been taken into local police custody. So we can flip back maybe to the questions and see what everybody thinks. So kind of where stigma showed up in that scenario, what could Tanya, Darcy, or the organization have done differently? How might applying and centering the principles of harm reduction and bodily autonomy could have made the scenario different? How Tanya, Darcy, and the organization's leaders could communicate better to avoid causing harm? And reflecting on some of the principles, what should happen next in this situation scenario?
And I think this is part of like what we're saying, harm reduction. There's a messiness to harm reduction because it's not clear cut, right? And we're dealing with real people, with real emotions, with the real world. And it's the piece that I love, and also the piece that can be really intense and sometimes frustrating to write, like when you have to unpack all this stuff to figure it out.
And I think the other part that can be really messy is that there is no kind of right response to some of these scenarios. So even if we think about the way that we could cause the least amount of harm possible, that, you know, things can still escalate, things can still happen. Other people who don't have the backgrounds and the framework that we have might still involve law enforcement without taking time to check in with people.
Absolutely. I would say that one of the things that we realized in the organization I used to work with before, we used to have housing for folks, for women, and we were placing people in shared housing. And one of the things that we realized that we were not doing was openly speaking about substance use in a way that was non-stigmatizing, because I think part of stigma is not talking about it and feeling and making people be really uncomfortable if they're using substances to share that they're using or express that to people. And then because we don't have that information, not being able to place people in situations that are healthier for them and less harmful, right? If we've had that information, we could have placed this particular participant that I'm thinking of with another participant that didn't have a previous history of substance use and would not feel triggered if someone was using in the apartment. But we did not have that information, and we placed them. One of them was someone who was actively engaged in substance use, and this other participant had a history of substance use and was in recovery and felt really threatened, right? So we were harming two people because we had not thought of communicating, and I saw someone chat something around communication to create a space of safe communication, right? To be able to make better decisions and give people better options, right?
Yeah, and I want to thank Susan in the chat for saying you can't force people to share about recovery. I think a big thing, and going back to trauma-informed care, which I think is a big harm reduction practice, is that if we are thinking about policies and structure in a way that is, you know, the realism in harm reduction is that people use drugs, and people have used drugs, and people will continue to use drugs. So if we're building out scenarios and situations and structure that's going to acknowledge that people use drugs, whether they tell us or not, then sometimes we can start framing and setting up these situations in different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the principles of harm reduction also call us to be pragmatic and realistic, right? And I think that that's a piece that is really, really helpful to keep in mind when we're thinking about, you know, as organizations, how do we have these conversations where people feel safe sharing? And also when we can acknowledge when there's tensions, right? Because both those two things are true, right? Like I really appreciate the comment of someone sharing, like, we shouldn't be forced to share if we're in recovery or not. Like, absolutely, yeah. It should be something that people feel that they want to do and feel safe in doing. And how, as an organization, as a structure, we can create systems where people can communicate that information to, not publicly necessarily, but to us, who are the people, you know, navigating those structures, so that they can then find ways to keep people safe and out of harm. And like, I think that's the piece when I was working in Puerto Rico that we forgot about, right? That we were called to be the ones to create the safe space for everybody, and to have the space where those conversations could happen, and to also learn and teach ourselves. And I think that's a piece of humility too. It's like we realized, oh, we don't know what we're doing really, and we need to stop and pause and learn, and not put the burden on someone else, but really take that on ourselves, which was really important as well, to learn more about the practices of harm reduction within feminist movements, within housing organizations, housing first. You know, how do we apply all these things so that we can create safer spaces for our participants to thrive and grow? And I see, yes, people were making a lot of assumptions, and assumptions are never good in this scenario. So how do we navigate that, and how do we become aware of when we're making assumptions, and how do we know when our judgments are coming up, right? Which is a piece that sometimes can be hard for folks, right? When we're not feeling safe, we go to a trauma response, right? It's to become, I know that my trauma response is to become really domineering and controlling of situations and things, and to try to tell people to do what I want them to do, because that makes me feel safe and better. And sometimes it works for me, maybe, but not for everybody else around me. And so trying to be mindful of that. And when I fall into that, to also not judge myself, right? To be gentle and kind with myself, and try to find other ways of approaching the situation that is more trauma informed. Oh, I love this question of restorative justice. Yes. How do we think those principles could come into play here?
Yeah, I think restorative justice and transformative justice is a huge part of harm reduction that maybe we don't get to talk about as much. Just in thinking about being realistic and pragmatic, is that no matter how much we try, we are going to mess up. And so thinking about that self-compassion for ourselves, and like acknowledging is part of being pragmatic, is that we're not going to get it right every single time, and having systems in place to handle when things go wrong, you know, is super important.
Yeah, and that both Darcy and Tanya are part of this community, and they are loving members of this community, and that either of them didn't set up to harm each other, but were caught in a situation where harm was caused. And we want to keep both people engaged and hear from them what they need from each other and from the community in order to continue to be part of it. And I love that piece of transformative justice, is like we center, you know, the person who experienced the harm, but also understanding that the person that caused the harm still can be part of that community, and we should try to create space for that there. So I really love those concepts as how they apply here.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about stigma and some of the big ways that it pushes people away and isolates people. So if we are still continuing to isolate people and not making ways for them to be part of community, then we're still replicating a lot of the systems.
Absolutely. And I think as organizations, part of the thing that we're doing at HRC also, and I think that has come up in some of the comments before we transition, is the incredible importance of communication grounded in harm reduction principles, right? In communication, transparency in communication, and the ways that we can communicate, acknowledging also that within communication, there's power, right? Who feels they can communicate, who has access to the ways of communication, whose communication is held up and listened to and centered, right? And so thinking about all of those things, and also as an organization, creating space to talk about that, and like what are the areas in communication that we're struggling, and how we can create systems of communication where everybody feels safe participating and being in that brave space with each other, and ways to communicate that are conversations can be difficult, but they're not necessarily have to be harmful, right? And I think that's also grounding compassion. I think someone wrote in the chat box. I think that it's so important to reminding ourselves of those principles, love and compassion to each other and for the community. And I think we can move to the next slide. So I want you all to think when you go home or you go back to some of the time. I have to go back to my computer to do some work because still in the Bay Area, still a little, I know it's later in the other side of the country, but here still I have some hours of work. So what are some of the things, what is one thing that you can do? And if people feel that they can write it up in the chat box, I would love that. One thing that you can change today about the way that you engage with others that can be more aligned, can have harm reduction and body autonomy be more aligned, where those two things are in sync. And I think I want to share that for me is always and forever will be listening, listening with an open heart and mind, and truly sitting there to hold that space for people.
No, that's a really nice one. I think that somebody whoever put the reminder about restorative and transformative justice is something I feel like sometimes slips my mind. So that's definitely something I'm gonna remember more keenly as a big part of bodily autonomy.
Patient and open-minded. Thank you. Not making assumptions out of other people's lives and experiences. I love that. Thank you. Yes, there's not one perfect methodology on a perfect day or in any day, right? Yes, we can always try to do our best with what we have, and what works for us may not necessarily work for others, and that's fine. We're trying to do our best and learn and grow. Okay, well, I encourage.
Yeah, we can go to our last, because I think we're over time also.
I love this. I love this. This final slide, because it reminds me of something that Emma always says, which is, when we're thinking of harm reduction, we're thinking of the principles of harm reduction and bodily autonomy, right? And you can provide all the tools and services to people. I always think you can give syringes, you can give cookers, you can give condoms, you can give referrals, you can do all those things. But if you're doing those things from a place of shame and stigma, but like Emma says, with a big bag of stigma attached to it, then you're not practicing harm reduction. But if you're treating people with love and kindness and respect, and you're allowing yourself to be in brave space with people and hold space and community for people, and challenging yourself and your own assumptions, and really being open to learning from each other, one another, and from the community, then we're practicing harm reduction and bodily autonomy. So those two things together is practicing harm reduction. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tanagra and Natalia, for sharing your wisdom and your compassion with us, as well as the tools around principles of harm reduction and the tools and the services, and how we really kind of bring that all together to practice harm reduction and move forward. We are over time, so thank you everybody for hanging in there. It was a really powerful conversation, and I didn't want to cut it off because I knew that we were getting to a scenario where people are going to have a chance to really kind of put this into practice. So I appreciate everybody for hanging in there. We're going to go ahead and share the recording as well as the slides with you tomorrow. We will also have an evaluation that we're going to be sending out. And so go ahead and talk about what you thought was useful on this webinar. Next webinars that you would like to continue this conversation on, as well as any feedback about how we could make it better. And once again, I just want to thank our partners at the Harm Reduction Coalition for bringing such generosity of spirit. I think that this is when we do the work best. I know this is when we do the work best, is when we each share our resources and bounce off and realize the similarities around it. So thank you all so much with
Thank you.
deep humility and love.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm humbled and honored. And please, thank you so much.
All right.
Bye,
wonderful.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.
And I'm going to go ahead and say, oh, and there's the slides if people would like to go ahead and contact either Tanagra or Natalia. There's their email. And then if you have any questions about how this is going to be engaged in PWN, you can go ahead and reach out to me or Benita Ray, who's our Deputy Director. So thank you all again. Stay safe, stay well, wash your hands, and looking forward to talking to each and every one of you soon.